He had overseen the division of the Treasury Department that auctioned off government debt, and he had warned for years about the systemic fragility that the Fed was encouraging. In retrospect, one of Powell's warnings took on particular significance. In 2013, he had predicted how hard it would be for the Fed to contain the damage when asset prices corrected. In any case, we ought to have a low level of confidence that we can regulate or manage our way around the kind of large, dynamic market event that becomes increasingly likely, thanks to our policy, he had said. The emergency actions Powell initiated on March 15 were a show of overwhelming force, by any standard. They were more far-reaching, larger, and faster-paced than any previous intervention ever taken by the central bank. But by Friday evening, March 20, a week of financial carnage proved that the Fed's actions weren't enough to stem the panic. By this point, Powell was already designing the next phase of the Fed's bailout, which would push the central bank into areas it had never been to before. The bank would, for the first time, directly purchase corporate bonds, CLO, and even corporate junk debt. This would expand the Fed to entirely new realms of the economic system, changing the debt markets from that point forward. This phase of the plan was not debated in formal FOMC meetings, which were transcribed for history. It was hashed out during a series of frantic phone calls between Jay Powell, John Williams at the New York Fed, and Fed officials like Governor Lael Brainerd. But Powell wasn't just talking to people inside the central bank. Many of his calls were routed to the U.S. Department of the Treasury. If the Fed was going to expand its reach where it needed approval from the Treasury Department. This happened to be a lucky break. The department was run by one of Powell's strongest allies in Washington, Steven Mnuchin. Ocean of PDF.com. Chapter 15. Winners and Losers, 2020. Steven Mnuchin was quick to point out that he had personally recommended Jay Powell as the next Fed chairman when President Trump was reviewing candidates. Such a recommendation went a long way in the Trump administration. A good word from someone like Mnuchin could be decisive in Trump's decision-making. Mnuchin was one of the few cabinet secretaries who served throughout Trump's full administration. While Trump had been impressed by Janet Yellen, Mnuchin had a stronger bond with Jay Powell. Both men had a long background in the world of private equity and leveraged loans. They spoke the same vocabulary of banking and deal-making and had a shared sensibility about the world. After Powell got the job, Mnuchin and Powell had lunch at least once a week. Mnuchin, like Powell, also had a granular understanding of markets and trading. He got his professional start at Goldman Sachs, where his father had been an influential partner. After 9 years at the firm, Mnuchin also made partner. He left Goldman in 2002 with company stock worth about $46 million. Mnuchin then joined a private equity fund called ESL Investments, then started his own hedge fund called Dune Capital. Mnuchin made a killing after the housing market crash of 2008 when he organized a group of investors, including Michael Dell, founder of the computer company, and George Soros. They bought a failed bank in California called IndyMac, which had been a major provider of failed home loans. They renamed the company One West and went on a home foreclosure spree, eventually selling the bank for $3.40 billion in 2015. Mnuchin knew how to manage sensitive situations and how to deal with problematic investors and clients. He also had a preternatural ability to blend into the background of the Trump administration while also retaining influence. Mnuchin could do this, in part, because he excelled at doing what Trump hated doing most, which was getting involved in details. When the coronavirus pandemic crushed the American economy, it was Mnuchin, not Donald Trump, who took the lead role in negotiating with Congress on behalf of the White House. This was a delicate job, since the House was controlled by Democrats and the Senate controlled by Republicans. Mnuchin talked frequently with Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic Speaker of the House, building a bridge between the White House and the opposition party. Congress had become a graveyard of ideas, ambition, and public purpose during the administration of Donald Trump. After passing the tax cut and a criminal justice reform law, Congress had done little else. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell focused most of his energy on appointing federal judges, which required only a bare majority of Republican votes. Nobody had big hopes for Congress when it came time to address the pandemic. Trump encouraged Congress to pass some kind of relief bill, without offering much in the way of guidance or support. Trump spent hours of his day performing manic monologues in front of the television cameras. By March 18, Congress had passed 2 relief bills totaling roughly $230 billion, which were wholly inadequate for the problem. A familiar rhythm developed in which promising signs of action would dissipate as soon as any plans for action moved to the poisonous atmosphere of the Senate, where McConnell helped suffocate them. This left America to depend upon, yet again, the Federal Reserve. But the Fed could not act alone if it was going to do the things that Powell was considering. During this period of March, Mnuchin and Powell talked on the phone roughly 20 times a day. There was a legal reason that Powell needed to talk with the Treasury Secretary. Congress had limited the Fed's emergency powers after the crash of 2008, when the Fed extended loans that were arranged quickly and with little oversight. When Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Reform Law of 2010, it included new restrictions on the Fed that required the bank to get approval from the U.S. Department of the Treasury for emergency actions that were not spelled out in the Fed's charter. When Congress created the Fed in 1913, lawmakers were cautious in defining the scope of the central bank's powers. They were just as careful in setting strict limits on what the bank could not do as they were in defining what it could do. The Fed was denied the power to lend directly to corporations or to take on risky debt like leveraged loans. This was designed in part so the Fed could not pick winners and losers in the economy by directly subsidizing some industries over others. The Fed arguably went outside this stricture in 2008 when it arranged loans for failing investment firms like Bear Stearns. But Dodd-Frank gave the Treasury Secretary clear oversight over such actions. This is why Powell had a copy of Dodd-Frank on his desk when he started working from home in March. Over the weekend of March 20th, he finalized the details on a complex rescue package that would include several interlocking bailouts, each targeting different parts of the financial system. This would be the largest, most far-reaching, and most consequential intervention in the history of the Federal Reserve. It would change the central bank's role in the American economy for at least decades to come, and dramatically increase the Fed's financial footprint. The package was arranged during phone calls between Powell and Mnuchin, Fed governors, and senior Fed staff members. Unlike formal FOMC meetings, these conversations were private and not transcribed for the public to review. The full FOMC did not vote on the program once it was finalized. Because the program was an emergency lending effort, it only required the approval of a handful of members on the Board of Governors. One participant in these discussions described the process as being the opposite of creative. The Fed wasn't trying to do anything innovative or novel. It was just figuring out which corners of the financial world were engulfed in flames, and then pointing the Fed's flood of new money in that direction. The Fed decided to resurrect a certain legal tool that it pioneered during the 2008 financial crisis, called a Special Purpose Vehicle, or SPV. An SPV was basically a shell company that allowed the Fed to get around the limits placed on its lending authority, using the U.S. Department of the Treasury as a partner. Many of the phone calls in March were between the Fed's lawyers in Washington and the Fed's financial team in New York, which would create the new SPVs. Each SPV was basically a company, formed jointly between the Fed and the Treasury Department. The company was registered in the state of Delaware, at a cost of about $10. The Treasury Department would invest taxpayer cash in each SPV, and then the Fed would use that cash as seed money to start making loans, lending as much as $10 for every dollar invested by the Treasury. This taxpayer money is what allowed the Fed to go outside its usual limits and start buying risky debt and extending loans to new parts of the economy. If there were any losses, the losses would be paid for first by the taxpayers, which helped the Fed make the legal argument that it was not, in fact, making risky loans. Powell would cite this fact as a justification for the programs. The Fed might be taking on more risk and expanding its mission, but the Treasury Department had oversight of the whole thing, which meant that there was some level of democratic oversight. The Fed created 3 important SPVs by the end of that weekend. The first 2 SPVs would allow the Fed to buy corporate debt. The motivation behind this was obvious. The Fed saw what was coming in the chain of failures as corporations defaulted on their loans, damaging the banks and hollowing out the value of CLO. To prevent this calamity, the Fed expanded the Fed put into an entirely new area of finance. People who traded stocks now assumed that the Fed would step in with a rescue package if the stock market ever crashed. Now people who traded corporate bonds and leveraged loans would have the same assurance. This had consequences that reverberated far beyond the corporate debt trading desks. The interest rates on corporate debt were supposed to measure the underlying risk of that debt. Risky companies had to pay very high interest rates, while safe companies paid low rates. Now that the Fed had stepped in and become a major buyer of corporate debt, providing a floor for the market, it changed the very nature of interest rates on the debt. Those rates didn't just reflect the risk of the company, but also reflected the Fed's appetite to buy the bond. Critically, once the Fed bought corporate bonds, it could never undo the action. The eager eyes on Wall Street would always remember what they had seen. Every time the Fed intervened, its future intervention was assumed. Perhaps the most groundbreaking SPV was the third one, which would buy debt of mid-sized businesses that were too small to get leveraged loans or corporate bonds. This program was wildly experimental. The Fed lawyers who constructed it only had the broad outlines in place when the program was announced. They planned to fill in the details later. The guiding principle of the program was that it would move the Fed's reach beyond the confines of Wall Street. Instead of using the primary dealers to implement this plan, the Fed would use regional banks as its conduit. The banks would give loans to small business, and the Fed would buy 95% of the loan, letting the regional bank hold the remainder. The Fed called this program the Main Street Lending Program. The final piece of the rescue plan was not a new SPV, but a massive influx of money in the form of a large-scale, near-permanent quantitative easing program. The parameters of this new round of QE would be left intentionally vague. The Fed would create as much money as it decided was necessary, for as long as it was needed. The scale was unprecedented. In 1 week, the Fed bought $625 billion in bonds, more than it purchased during the entire program that Tom Hoenig voted against. By Sunday evening, March 22, the plan was largely pulled together. But there was one small problem. The plan called for the Treasury Department to invest about $454 billion into the new SPVs, which would enable the Fed to loan about $4 trillion in new debt. But Congress had not yet passed a relief bill that would authorize the use of $454 billion of taxpayer money. Powell and his team decided they would not wait on Congress. They would announce the new SPVs on Monday morning, March 23, before the markets opened. The Fed's announcement on that morning was radical, and it was enough to stop the panic. In roughly 90 days, the Fed would create $3 trillion. That was as much money as the Fed would have printed in roughly 300 years at its normal pace, before the 2008 financial crisis. There was virtually no public opposition to the Fed's actions, and Powell expanded the Fed's efforts. Within less than 3 weeks of its first rescue package, the Fed announced new actions that built on what it had already done. Once again, the plan was not voted upon by the full FOMC, and there are no transcripts available to determine the thinking behind the new initiatives, parts of which were approved by a unanimous, closed-door vote on April 8. The Fed announced on April 9 that it wouldn't only buy corporate bonds, it would also buy even riskier bonds, which were rated as junk debt. The junk bond purchases would not be unlimited. The Fed would only buy debt that had been rated as investment grade before the pandemic. These bonds were called fallen angels on Wall Street, and they included debt from companies like Ford Motor Company. By purchasing the debt of fallen angels, the Fed was also helping out the much larger pools of even riskier corporate junk, such as Rexnord's, that already existed. When the debt of fallen angels crashed down the rating scale, it would displace these other loans and make them far less attractive to purchase. The Fed had stopped this potential cascade. Also that day, the Fed updated a separate new program, called TALF, for Term Asset-Backed Securities Loan Facility, so that it could directly purchase, for the first time, big chunks of CLO debt, which was composed of leverage loans. This was a significant extension of the Fed's safety net, and it played a large role in quelling the anxiety around the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of flow that faced loan write-downs and breaches of their standard caps. It also helped the big banks that owned billions in CLO debt. All of this barely penetrated the public conversation or the cable news landscape. The reasons were predictable. Everything was cloaked in language that was obtuse and incomprehensible. As the Fed put it, the SMCCFII was amended and expanded, while the TALF added a new asset class to support the flow of credit to households and businesses. Not thrilling stuff. And even less compelling on a day when 35,000 new coronavirus cases were reported, compared to 201 on the same day of the preceding month, and states were closing down restaurants and stores. But to people who actually traded bonds, and who packaged and sold them, the news was shocking. It was one of those things that divided history. There was the way things worked before the SPVs were created, and the way things worked afterward. Fundamentally, we have now socialized credit risk. And we have forever changed the nature of how our economy functions, said Scott Minerd, the Fed advisor and senior trader at Guggenheim Investments. The Fed has made it clear that prudent investing will not be tolerated. Just the announcement of the Fed's program was enough to soothe bond dealers and CLO operators. The Fed bought only a tiny fraction of available corporate bonds, not nearly enough to prop up the entire market, but it had telegraphed that it would be there if the trouble resumed, and its pocketbook was bottomless. This was evidence of the program's success, in the eyes of its creators. Steven Mnuchin, at the Treasury, was particularly pleased. The day we jointly announced that transaction, and the commitment to it, that unlocked the entire corporate bond market, Mnuchin later said. These actions, as dramatic as they were, directly benefited only a small group of people, those who owned assets or those who made a living trading them. But the financial crisis the Fed was fighting was a different thing than the much broader crisis of the coronavirus pandemic. The virus was inflicting incalculable damage across American society, in areas the Fed could not address. The hospital system was overwhelmed. Emergency room nurses wore improvised protective gear made out of garbage bags. The virus spread more quickly because many workers who got sick did not have paid sick leave, so they stayed on the job and infected others. State governors had to compete with one another to obtain necessary supplies, such as viral testing kits. Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland smuggled a planeload of test kits from South Korea, which were kept under armed guard when they arrived. Restaurants, theaters, stores, and schools closed down, in order to slow the infection. But while they were closed, the federal government failed entirely to implement any kind of unified response to the virus. This failure left businesses and schools with a terrible choice in late spring. They could either reopen, with the pandemic worse than before, or remain shut. During this period, roughly 22 million American jobs disappeared, creating the worst jobs crisis since the Great Depression. The central bank could not address these things, and for many years central bank leaders had complained that their counterparts in Congress did not do enough to address the many deep problems that afflicted the economy. Jay Powell had echoed these thoughts, and had launched key parts of the March rescue package without waiting for Congress. But just days after the Fed's groundbreaking SPVs were announced, Congress would step into the breach. It would pass one of the largest, most expensive bills in modern history, called the CARES Act. This was the chance for Mnuchin, Trump, Pelosi, and McConnell to show that they could solve big problems, and that the U.S. government could lend a hand when it was needed. The CARES Act authorized $2 trillion in spending to counteract the pandemic, including $454 billion in taxpayer money to fund the Fed's SPVs. The part of the CARES Act that got the most attention was the roughly $292 billion chunk of the spending that went directly to people. There was good reason for this spending to get the attention that it did. The impact was immediate and beneficial for the millions of people who received it. And the government had never truly done something like this before, sending direct payments to people regardless of their previous level of tax payments, or even of their current level of need. These direct benefits were coupled with more benefits for those who had been directly affected by the lockdowns. Unemployment insurance benefits, administered by the states, were boosted by $600 a week through July. That benefit was partially extended that summer, although at a lower level. The spending that went straight into people's bank accounts was the most visible part of the CARES Act. But it was a relatively small part of the overall relief spending approved by Congress, which included the CARES Act and 3 smaller bills. Over half of all that money was aimed at businesses, according to an analysis by the Washington Post based on data from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. A vanishingly small share of the $4 trillion was allocated to address the public health crisis created by the pandemic, or to slow the virus's spread. The largest chunk of the money, totaling $670 billion, funded an emergency loan program called the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP. The idea was that the businesses would get a PPP loan, keep their employees, and then the loan would be forgiven when the businesses reopened and everyone went back to work. This money could have potentially helped a huge and diverse population of business owners who had suffered terribly during the long and punishing lockdowns. And it did help millions of businesses. But more than half of all the PPP money went to just 5% of the companies that received the loans. Even that figure understated the narrowness of the impact. Fully 25% of all the PPP went to 1% of the companies. These were the big law firms and national food chains, which got the maximum PPP amount of $10 million. Those beneficiaries included the Boston Market restaurant chain and the high-powered law firm of Boies Schiller Flexner. An analysis by the Federal Reserve and others found that the PPP program saved about 2.3 million jobs at a cost of $286,000 per job, after President Trump claimed it would save or support 50 million jobs. About $651 billion of the CARES Act was in the form of tax breaks for businesses, which were often complicated to obtain. This meant that the tax benefits went largely to the big companies that could hire the best tax lawyers. The Cheesecake Factory restaurant chain, for example, claimed a tax break of $50 million, even as it furloughed 41,000 people. About $250 billion of the tax breaks were given to any business in any industry, without regard to how much they might have been hurt by the pandemic. People who owned businesses were given tax breaks worth $135 billion, meaning that about 43,000 people who earned more than $1 million a year each got a benefit worth $1.60 million. By and large, these billions of dollars were quietly absorbed into corporate treasuries and personal bank accounts around the country. The wildly unequal distribution of the money was not made public until months later, after the Washington Post won an open records lawsuit that made the information public. The unequal distribution of federal aid, from both Congress and the Federal Reserve, exposed the underlying structure of America's economic system in 2020. As the dollars flowed through the nation's financial plumbing, they illuminated which parts of that system worked quite well and which did not. The system that the Fed used to deliver money to the primary dealers, for example, worked with the speed, smoothness, and efficiency of a hypermodern and well-maintained network. The money for everyone else migrated through a neglected, leaky network that failed to deliver the relief that was advertised. One reason the PPP loans failed to make their way to small businesses in need was that the loans were processed through the Small Business Administration, which was supposed to work with participating banks. The SBA was a sleepy agency that had never administered an emergency program of this scale. Not surprisingly, the companies that fared the best in this system were the companies that could best navigate a complex and overwhelmed bureaucracy. Inside the Trump administration, the intervention was seen as a success. Steven Mnuchin, for one, wanted to get the emergency money out the door quickly, even if some of it went to companies or people that might not need it. He didn't want the ideally perfect program to be the enemy of the realistically good one. Mnuchin knew that some of the money was misdirected. He publicly chastised the Los Angeles Lakers for taking a $4.60 million loan, calling it outrageous. But Mnuchin believed the rapid response, combining the fiscal spending with the monetary stimulus, was the only thing that staved off a worse disaster. Never in the history of the Fed has there been coordinated action with the Treasury and the Fed, the way there was in March and April of that year. Nothing in the financial crisis comes even close to this, Mnuchin recalled later. I think that if we had collectively not done what we did, certain actions we did together and certain actions the Fed did independently, I think we would have had a Great Depression. There was a growing sensitivity inside the Federal Reserve about the central bank's public image. Jay Powell led an effort to portray the bank as a vehicle to help the middle class. In 2019, before the pandemic, Powell had gone on a listening tour to hear the concerns and ideas of working people and to discuss how the bank might help them. There was a strategic reason for this. Senior leaders at the Fed knew that it was unpopular to help the very rich while everyone else languished. The Fed's bailouts in 2008 and 2009 played a formative role in animating both the Tea Party movement on the right and the Occupy Wall Street movement on the left. The conservative backlash was particularly intense and led to strident calls for the Fed to be audited, more tightly regulated, or even disbanded altogether. This was recognized by those who participated in the Fed's internal lessons learned sessions, including the former senior economist Claudia Sahm. The Fed always gets slammed. Because it's easy. No one understands what the heck they are. They seem like they care about Wall Street. So they will get hit, Sahm said. After the Fed announced its new programs in late March, Sahm and others were worried about the backlash. I mean, the End the Fed movement in 4 years, I don't even want to think about what it looks like, she said. It was difficult to argue that buying junk bonds and clo would help a Starbucks barista who was out of a job. But the Fed did have one program that it could point to when it made the case that it was working hard to help people outside Wall Street. This was the Main Street Lending Program. The program was kind of like the checks sent to people under the CARES Act. It got a lot of attention. It was new, and even shocking to the people who followed the history of the Fed. It would push the Fed into the terrain of giving credit directly to companies that could tap the bond market, all across America. The Fed was breaking barriers and expanding its reach, and was doing it all to help small businesses. The Main Street program allowed the Fed to argue that it wasn't just bailing out asset owners and hedge funds and Wall Street banks. In April, the conservative and influential economist Glenn Hubbard told the Wall Street Journal that the success of the Main Street program was important. It would show that the Fed could use its creative energies to help people outside of Wall Street. I'm really worried it's not going to work, Hubbard told the newspaper. It did not work. The Main Street program was unwieldy, complicated, and difficult to use. It relied on local and regional banks to first make loans to small businesses, which the Fed would then buy. But the Fed also insisted that the local banks keep 5% of the loan value, meaning the banks had to absorb some risk. The banks were also deterred by the expense and work entailed with making loans to so many companies that might be in dire straits, with little chance of survival. The Main Street program had been built to purchase as much as $600 billion in loans. It had purchased a little more than $17 billion in loans by December, the month that it was shut down. This didn't mean that the Fed's bailout programs were ineffective. It's just that they were effective only for certain people. The real bailout, the successful bailout, was shockingly strong and swift. This was the bailout for people who owned assets. The owners of stock were made entirely whole within about 9 months of the pandemic crash. So were the owners of corporate debt. Starting in March, when the Fed intervened, the stock market began one of the largest, fastest booms in its history, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average exploding in value. The market hit its low point in mid-March, when the Treasury market collapsed. But between that day and the middle of June, in just 3 months, the market's value surged by 35%. In the 3 months after that, it rose by another 7%. By then, stocks were trading at the same value they had when restaurants, movie theaters, hotels, and cruise ships were operating at full capacity. The average monthly returns on leveraged loans were restored as early as April. By August, so many new investment-grade bonds were issued that the previous record, set in 2017, was broken. As always, asset price inflation was portrayed in the media as a boom. And this time the boom was so intense that it was almost surreal. Millions of people were out of work, millions more were in constant danger of being evicted, restaurants were shuttered, and hundreds of thousands of people were dying. But the debt and equity markets were on fire. During the summer of 2020, the stock market was personified by an overcaffeinated man in his mid-40s named David Portnoy, who sat alone in a big empty room and shouted into a computer camera that live-streamed his thoughts. Portnoy was one of those internet-famous people who knew exactly how to capture attention and maintain it. In 2003, he had launched a free newspaper in Boston called Barstool Sports, which evolved over the years into a well-trafficked website. Barstool Sports was richly baited to draw interest and produce outrage. One series of articles assigned letter grades to female teachers who got arrested for molesting students. One teacher was graded harshly with a C for not sharing explicit photos of herself. All of it kept people talking about Portnoy, and in return he kept giving people things to talk about. In the spring and early summer of 2020, Portnoy started to talk about the stock market, launching a show called Davey Day Trader Global. He sat in front of his webcam and talked about stocks the way radio hosts talked about baseball stats. Because stock prices were rising, then rising again, gambling in the stock market gained an addictive edge. Portnoy took callers as he broadcast his show, including a man who apparently went by the name Balls, and who told Portnoy to buy stock in the fast food chain Shake Shack. Balls said, "Go long. I'm going long. Another $500,000 on Shake Shack," Portnoy shouted during one video. Portnoy bragged about his profits and advertised the thrill of it all. Viewers who wanted to join the fun could do so by creating an account on the stock trading platform called Robinhood, which had been founded in 2013. Robinhood charged no fees for trading stock, enticing people to open up 10 million accounts on its platform by the end of 2019. These were average people who put their stock trades on credit cards or paid for them with home equity loans. This made Robinhood's platform look like something that democratized high finance, moving the riches of stock trading from Wall Street to the family living room. But Robinhood's business model was dominated by the same big players that already operated at the peak of financial power. The people who traded on Robinhood were not the company's real customers. Its real customers were big hedge funds and trading firms like Citadel Securities. Robinhood might have organized all the trading through its app, but the trades were actually executed by companies like Citadel. These firms paid Robinhood millions of dollars for the privilege because it allowed them to see what people were buying, then make trades based on that information as they filled the order. This was called paying for order flow. Robinhood earned about $19,000 from trading firms for each dollar that a normal retail investor had in their account. Robinhood's cash from order flow more than tripled from the start of 2020 to the same period in 2021. It is unclear how much money Citadel earned from the arrangement because it is privately held. Market swings were hard to predict, but Citadel had a good view into how things worked at the Federal Reserve. In 2015, the company hired Ben Bernanke to be a senior advisor. Bernanke said that he typically worked for Citadel only a few days a year, sharing his views on the economy or occasionally showing up for client events to be interviewed. He declined to say how much he earned for such events, but Citadel was shown to pay well. The company paid Janet Yellen between $710,000 and $760,000 to give speeches in 2019 and 2020, according to financial disclosure forms. Firms like Citadel benefited when trading activity became feverish, as it did in the summer of 2020, helped along by media personalities like Portnoy. During one video, Portnoy seemed genuinely angry that some people cautioned against dumping money into the stock market. "Where are the haters now?" he bellowed. "Now I have both hands on the steering wheel. And I'm taking this thing to the fucking moon. We're going to drive right over all the haters. And people are mad. Why are you mad? Get on board. Buy. Everyone makes money. Everyone makes money. Buy. 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 We make money. Why the haters? Why are you shorting the market? Because you're wrong and outdated? Because I've proven you to be a fool in 2 months? Turn these machines on." They did turn the machines on. Robinhood added 3 million new accounts in 2020. The insanity of all this seemed distant from the world of Jay Powell. He continued giving speeches and engaging in listening tours, which were virtual now. He testified before Congress and projected the image of a steadfast leader. Jay Powell was, by and large, hailed as a hero. The crisis response of 2020 marked a high point in Powell's career. He had quietly served in the background at very powerful institutions like the Treasury Department, the Carlyle Group, and the Fed. But now he was the central actor of the world's most powerful central bank. There was no political downside, ever, to acting aggressively at the Fed in times of distress. The balance sheet of the Fed, which had been a source of worry when it was $4.50 trillion, would grow to $7.40 trillion with no sign of stopping. The controversial programs that Ben Bernanke had employed to go below zero were now background operations, employed as standard practice. The real attention was on the new experimental actions and what might come next. Virtually no one believed that the Fed was finished. Powell's predecessors, and virtually everyone else in a position of power in the world of banking, monetary policy, or governance, praised him for what he did. They also acknowledged that it would take years, if not decades, to unwind the actions the Fed had taken in a matter of months. But that problem would be left for tomorrow. Ben Bernanke began an interview in April 2020 with an unsolicited comment. "Jay Powell has done an excellent job in a difficult situation," he said. Janet Yellen went further when asked about the Fed's recent actions. "I think they're heroic and I'm really supportive. I'm really impressed by what they did." In supporting Powell's actions, Yellen provided an expansive view of the Fed's power and its role in America. The Fed wasn't just supposed to maintain a stable money supply and be the lender of last resort to banks in times of trouble. That view was outdated, she suggested, in part because the financial system had become so dominated by hedge funds, private equity firms, or other entities that were sometimes referred to as the shadow banking system. The Fed was there to back them all up in times of crisis. "This is why the Fed was invented and this is what they're doing now," Yellen said. She portrayed the coronavirus pandemic as something like a bank panic that went beyond the banks and affected the entire American economy. The Fed was now the lender of last resort for everyone. When the coronavirus came along and people realized how very serious it was going to be, there was just a huge, broad-based flight from risky assets of every type. And that's like a modern-day bank run. Again, fortunately the banks, the core banking system, is in good shape. Again, this was centered in the shadow banking system. People are terrified of losses and they're running from lending and want to be in the safety of cash. The role of the central bank is to take risks, to avoid harm to the economy, when no one else is willing to do so, Yellen said. The bailout of 2020, the largest expenditure of American public resources since World War II, solidified and entrenched an economic regime that had been quietly and steadily constructed, largely by the Federal Reserve, during the previous decade. The resources from this bailout went largely to the entities that were strengthened by the policies of ZIRP and QE. It went to large corporations that used borrowed money to buy out their competitors, It went to the very richest of Americans who owned the vast majority of assets. It went to the riskiest of financial speculators on Wall Street, who used borrowed money to build fragile positions in global markets. And it went to the very largest U.S. banks, whose bigness and inability to fail was now an article of faith. And all of this happened at a moment when Americans were more distracted, more beleaguered, and more financially distressed than at any moment in modern history. It was difficult to even comprehend the impact of what had happened. But the impact would make itself visible in the months, years, and likely decades to come. The vote was taken by Powell, his vice chairman Richard Clarida, and the governors Randall Quarles, Lael Brainerd, and Michelle Bowman. The secondary market corporate credit facility, as the Fed called one of its corporate bond buying programs. Oceanofpdf.com. Chapter 16. The Long Crash, 2020-2021. After he was laid off from Rexnord, John Feltner was determined to keep his life on track. He and Nina had been planning for a long time to save up enough money to buy the house they rented near Silver Spoon Drive. The couple didn't seem willing to let go of that goal. In the first few months after he lost his factory job, Feltner bounced around between temporary gigs. He got a job doing maintenance work at a grocery store. He later got a contracting job, also in maintenance. He had suspected that he wouldn't be able to find a steady job that paid as much as his unionized position at Rexnord. He was right, but he kept pressing and he did eventually find a full-time position in the maintenance department of a big hospital. It paid less than Rexnord, but it was dependable. Nina had work in the human resources department of a company that provided at-home mental health care. It took some time, but they did save up the money, and they did buy their house. Also, thanks to luck, they worked in healthcare, one of the few industries that weren't shut down or interrupted by the coronavirus pandemic. By the end of 2020, Feltner's workday started in the late afternoon. He started getting ready a little after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when he pulled out of his driveway and began his long commute. The quickest way to get to work took about 40 minutes. The first part of the route went along Interstate 70, toward Indianapolis, past a monotonous background of farmland that was wide open and empty during the long winter months. From there, the route went north on the big highway loop around the edge of the city, to Community North Hospital, a large medical complex that looked like a self-contained office park. Feltner's shift ran from 3:30 in the afternoon to about 11:30 at night, when the complex was mostly quiet. The first COVID-19 case in Indiana was diagnosed at Community North on March 6. By November, the state had about 200,000 cases and 5,000 deaths. Another 5,000 people would die in the state in the following couple of months. The whole thing made life surreal for people like Feltner. The hospital eventually set up a temporary tent facility in a parking lot to conduct drive-through testing for the virus, creating the feel of emergency barracks. Feltner wore a face mask during his entire shift. His social life slammed to a halt, and Nina set up a home office in an upstairs bedroom. The couple's daughter lived at home, although her healthcare job took her out of the house. The Feltners stopped seeing their friends, and heard through the rumor mill when their neighbors got sick. Feltner stayed very busy at work, which was a blessing in its way. People in the restaurant and hotel businesses would be out of work for months. Feltner belonged to the group of workers deemed essential, meaning that he didn't have the option to work from home, at a safe distance from others. America's essential workers in 2020 put in very long hours and crisscrossed a largely abandoned landscape, delivering food, working at grocery store checkout counters, using their cars, staffing hospitals, and keeping factories and warehouses humming around the clock. They often did this at great personal risk, getting sick from COVID-19 at a far higher rate than workers who stayed at home. Feltner and Nina were among the fortunate. They never caught coronavirus, or at least didn't have any symptoms if they did. Neither did their daughter, even though her job took her on home visits to people who did have the virus. The federal bailouts did have a significant impact on these essential workers. Evictions were held at bay, and the emergency payments helped them meet bills. But the majority of the government's largesse bypassed places like the Feltners' neighborhood. The economic recovery of 2020 was a gated recovery, with the money flowing to selected, exclusive zip codes. The people who did well did very well, but the rest did not. The Fed surveyed businesses with fewer than 500 employees and found that 90% of them were still suffering from a downturn in sales by the end of the year. About 30% of those companies said they would probably go out of business if they didn't get more federal aid. For Feltner, the bailouts were a marginal issue, something that didn't matter very much in his daily life. The one-time payments mailed out to everyone didn't do anything to arrest the much longer downward slide that defined the decades of Feltner's working life. Before the financial crisis, when he worked at the auto parts maker Navistar, Feltner earned about $80,000 a year or more when overtime pay was included. At Rexnord, he earned about $60,000. At the hospital, he earned about $46,000. And at each job his benefits had been scaled back and his healthcare costs had risen. He wasn't alone in this regard. The middle class had experienced a very long and deep slide in its earning power, bargaining power, and wages. Virtually nothing had changed this trajectory during the decade between 2010 and 2020. The economy had grown, but the growth was captured by a smaller and smaller share of the population. Feltner and his neighbors weren't just excluded from the lion's share of the 2020 bailout. They had been excluded from the benefits of ZIRP and QE and the asset price inflation that those policies created. The entire bottom half of the US population owned about 2% of all the nation's assets. The top 1% of the population owned 31%. This helped explain why the households in the very middle of America's income scale, meaning the middle 20%, saw their median net worth rise by only 4% between 1989 and 2016. During the same period, the net worth of people in the top 20% more than doubled. The wealth of the top 1% nearly tripled. Millions of people in the middle class were falling behind. To compensate for this fact, they took on loads of cheap debt, which helped them feel like they were at least remaining in place. Consumer debt hit $14 trillion in late 2019, a record level even after adjusting for inflation. The only good news seemed to be that interest rates on the debt were lower. Households were spending about 10% of their disposable income in servicing debt in 2019, which was down from 13% right before the global financial crisis. Feltner was an optimistic guy by nature. He talked about the local boom in construction that seemed to be underway in 2020, and the fact that skilled trade workers were in such high demand. His daughter found work as a home healthcare aide, and his two sons also had full-time jobs, doing maintenance work on vehicles for a local school district. Things were pretty good at the end of the day. One of Feltner's sons welcomed a new baby during the pandemic, which helped keep everyone's mind off the gloomier realities of what was going on. But Feltner also felt a nagging fear about his kids' futures. All of them had started working when they were young, and they knew how to work hard and be dependable. But it wasn't clear anymore that hard work was a pathway to a dependable living or a stable life. Feltner didn't know if his kids could expect to earn even as much as he had earned. "It scares the hell out of me. It really does," he said. "It's almost like we've become the commodities ourselves, you know what I'm saying?" Feltner said, the value of workers had been diminished, but the value of other commodities was on the rise. The Fed was making sure of it. Jay Powell had become a figure like the Wizard of Oz by December 2020. To most people, Powell was a disembodied face that flickered on a large screen, delivering proclamations from on high. The Fed's press conferences were now held by videoconference after each FOMC meeting. The choreographed events began with an image of Powell, standing in front of a large blue curtain and reading scripted comments. When he was finished, Powell took questions from reporters who suddenly appeared on screen, each of them a small face framed within squares arranged in a large grid across the screen. The reporters were sitting in various home offices and apartments, and they spoke into awkwardly angled cameras. On December 16, Powell made a big announcement. Some of the most important emergency measures the Fed had deployed during the spring would now be made semi-permanent. While the Main Street lending program was sputtering to a quiet end, other parts of the bailout would endure. The Fed would keep interest rates at zero, and would now conduct $120 billion in quantitative easing every month for the foreseeable future. That was about a decade's worth of money creation, at historic rates, conducted every 30 days. It would continue, Powell said, until substantial further progress has been made toward healing the economy. When that might occur was anyone's guess. Powell said the Fed would continue to intervene as long as price inflation didn't rise above 2% for an extended period of time, an eventuality that he said was unlikely in the near future. The price of certain items had spiked because of supply disruptions, but weak growth and weak demand were smothering prices overall. Asset price inflation, however, was accelerating without restraint. The stock market was doing so well in December that it didn't even make sense to the people who were making money off it. A web-based food delivery company called DoorDash went public that month, and its stock nearly doubled immediately. The online rental company Airbnb went public and its shares more than doubled. This might sound great for those companies, but when share prices jump so quickly, it means that the firm's original owners have lost out on a lot of money because they've priced their shares too low. A video game company called Roblox suspended its initial public offering in December, as it tried to make sense of the market, according to the Wall Street Journal. The value of stock market shares was as high as any time since the dot-com boom, when compared to actual company revenue. If that didn't make sense to people, then things weren't going to make sense for a long time. The market broke records and then broke them again in the months to come. The market for corporate debt was just as strong. By the end of 2020, companies issued more than $1.90 trillion in new corporate debt, beating the previous record that was set in 2017. Business for leveraged loans and CLO was booming. American companies would carry this debt for many years to come because of the way it was structured. Companies had to either roll the debt by selling it again, or pay it in full when the loan expired. The corporate debt binge brought a new and troubling term into corporate America's lexicon, something called the zombie company. A zombie company was a firm that carried so much debt that its profits weren't enough to cover its loan costs. The only thing that kept zombie companies out of bankruptcy was the ability to roll their debt perpetually. During 2020, nearly 200 major publicly traded companies entered the ranks of the zombie army, according to an analysis by Bloomberg News. These weren't just marginal or risky firms, but included well-known firms like Boeing, ExxonMobil, Macy's, and Delta Airlines. When Bloomberg analyzed 3,000 large, publicly traded firms, it found that about 20% of them were zombies. These companies posed a risk beyond their own financial stability. Their existence suppressed economic productivity because they consumed investments and resources that might have gone to new firms or entrepreneurs. Powell's political standing in Washington had never been higher. His fortune seemed to rise even higher in November, when President Trump lost his bid for re-election to the Democrat Joe Biden, the former vice president. Word soon leaked out that Biden's pick for Treasury Secretary was Powell's former boss and colleague Janet Yellen. Experts in D.C. expected that the Fed and the White House would now have one of the most cooperative relationships in recent memory. On the way out of office, Trump's administration had a final spat with the Fed. Mnuchin, who had worked so closely with Powell, announced that the Treasury would no longer support the special-purpose vehicles the Treasury and the Fed had created together, like the program that bought corporate junk debt. The vehicles would be closed down at the end of the year. The Federal Reserve opposed this move and released a statement saying as much. But Mnuchin said that his reasoning was simple. The CARES Act specifically said that the Fed's emergency SPVs should close at the end of 2020. There seemed to be little reason to extend the programs now that markets for stocks and corporate bonds were booming. I had every intention of following what I saw as the clear interpretation of the law, Mnuchin later said. The Fed pressed Mnuchin to keep the facilities open in case markets reversed, but he felt that doing so would come with a cost. The downside was that some future Treasury security is going to have to go back to Congress at some point in the next 100 years and ask for these kinds of emergency programs. And I think the fact that I was a good steward of this, and gave back the capital as the law was written, will be a good precedent for future Treasury secretaries. When Mnuchin announced that the programs would close, it did not disrupt the booming market for corporate debt or stocks. Investors had seen that the Fed would intervene on their behalf, and that was apparently enough to keep them optimistic. On January 6, 2021, thousands of violent extremists laid siege to the United States Capitol. Inside the building, members of Congress were conducting the once formal process of counting the electoral votes that were submitted by the states. Biden had won the election handily, but President Trump did not concede. Trump alleged that a wide-ranging and ever-shifting criminal conspiracy had stolen the election from him. Trump's followers smashed windows, broke open doors, sprayed police officers with bear repellent, and pushed their way into the House and Senate chambers, forcibly shutting down the transfer of power. For about 6 long hours, the U.S. political system hung in a suspended state. The transfer of power resumed that night, after police managed to regain control of the building and the rioters had been allowed to walk back to their hotels. It was the most effective attack on American democracy since the Civil War, and it marked an entirely new level of volatility in American society. The following day, the Dow Jones Industrial Average jumped 1.4%, closing at a record high. That month, millions of traders on the retail platform Robinhood helped drive up shares in a video game rental company called GameStop. The company's rising share value was puzzling when compared against its underlying economic health. The storefront business was suffering massive losses of customer traffic during the coronavirus lockdowns, and was arguably being made technologically obsolete by internet streaming. Its stock was jumping by double digits. During a news conference in late January, Jay Powell was asked repeatedly about the possibility that the Fed was fueling an asset bubble. Inside the FOMC meetings, the Fed's own experts talked repeatedly about the ways that quantitative easing boosted all asset prices, along with the stock market. Powell said that the Fed was monitoring asset prices but wasn't overly concerned. When he was pressed on the topic, he seemed almost exasperated. I think that the connection between low interest rates and asset values is probably something that's not as tight as people think because a lot of different factors are driving asset prices at any given time, he said. Tom Hoenig spent the long winter of 2020-2021 as so many people did, in isolation. Instead of visiting his grandchildren, he saw them through FaceTime chats. Once the weather got cold in Kansas City, Tom and Cynthia spent a lot of time around the house and rarely saw their friends. They figured out the little tricks of survival in the new world, like determining that the best time to do grocery shopping was on Wednesday afternoon, at about 3 o'clock, when no one else seemed to be at the store. They wore double-layered face masks as they walked through the grocery aisles, which were now marked one way, and they stood a respectful distance from the cashier at the checkout counter, who wore a plastic face visor. One thing that kept Tom Hoenig going was the feeling that he could do useful work. In the mornings, he woke up early and read the news on his iPad. He kept up with the Fed's actions through the coverage in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, among other publications. He spent a lot of time in his home office, writing essays and opinion pieces that offered his best perspective on what the Fed and the bank regulators ought to be doing. He published some of these essays in Discourse, the online publication of the Mercatus Center think tank, where he was a senior fellow. In May 2020, Hoenig published an essay urging people to think about what the Fed's actions during the crisis might mean over the long term. Emergency spending was vital to fighting the pandemic, he wrote. These policies, while necessary in the short term, place an ever larger mortgage against the nation's future income, and extending them beyond the crisis period could have significant negative unintended consequences. Hoenig had made a similar argument in 2010. He was saying that the United States needed to think about what it was going to do when the immediate crisis was over. Would the country use democratically elected institutions to confront its problems, or would it rely on its central bank once again? When Honig went on his long spree of descending votes in 2010, the Fed's balance sheet had been $2.30 trillion. That was a radically high amount by historical standards, and was more than twice the size of the balance sheet before the 2008 financial crisis. In May 2020, the Fed's balance sheet was $7 trillion, and continuing to grow under the near-permanent flow of quantitative easing. Honig's warnings in 2020 were different in one important way from his warnings a decade earlier. Now he could point to the historical record. In his essay, Honig compared the period of economic growth between 2010 and 2018 with the period a decade earlier, between 1992 and 2000. These periods were comparable because they were both long periods of economic stability after a recession, he argued. In the 1990s, labor productivity in the United States increased at an annual average rate of 2.3%. During the decade of ZIRP, it rose by only 1.1%. Real median weekly earnings for wage and salary employees rose by 0.7% on average annually during the 1990s, but rose by only 0.26% during the 2010s. Average real GDP growth, a measure of the overall economy, rose an average of 3.8% annually during the 1990s, but by only 2.3% during the recent decade. The only part of the economy that seemed to benefit under ZIRP was the market for assets. The stock market more than doubled in value during the 2010s. Even after the crash of 2020, the markets continued their stellar growth and returns. Honig wasn't optimistic about what American life might look like after another decade of weak growth, wage stagnation, and booming asset values that primarily benefited the rich. This was something he talked about a lot, both publicly and privately. In his mind, economics and the banking system were tightly intertwined with American society. One thing affected the other. When the financial system benefited only a handful of people, average people started to lose faith in society as a whole. When they saw the biggest banks get bailed out while middle-class wages faltered, it made people feel like the system was rigged. Honig argued in public speeches that this was a good reason to pursue bank reform. Over coffee at a bakery in downtown Washington, in 2019, Honig said that the misallocation of resources under ZIRP very likely contributed to the undercurrents tearing apart American society. Do you think that we would have had the political, shall we say turmoil, revolution, we had in 2016, had we not had this great divide created? Had we not had the effects of the zero interest rates that benefited some far more than others? Honig asked. I don't know. It's a counterfactual. But it's a question I would like to pose. In 2021, as he sat at home in Kansas City, Honig seemed interested in talking about one issue above all. It was the need for long-term thinking. He recalled a piece of advice he'd once gotten from a Swiss central banker that always stuck with him. We are responsible for the long run, so the short run can take care of itself, the central banker had said. The Fed was supposed to be an ideal institution for long-term thinking because it was insulated from voters in elections. But Honig didn't believe that long-term thinking dominated the decisions of 2010 or beyond. The short run was the focal point, he said. This wasn't just a problem that afflicted central bankers. It seemed to increasingly dominate the thinking of corporations, government institutions, and the concerns of average citizens. Everyone had a short-term need that makes the long-term impossible to look to, Honig said. This mattered a lot, because long-term thinking would be indispensable to confronting America's economic problems in 2021. The financial crash that happened in the spring of 2020 was smothered so rapidly, by so much new money from the Fed, that most people didn't know it had happened. But the consequences of the crash were dire. On the morning of March 11, 2021, as Honig was reading the Wall Street Journal, he came across a particularly alarming story. Like so much of the important news about America's money and debt, this article carried a seemingly benign headline: Wave of new debt to test Treasury market. The story explained the deep vulnerability roiling beneath the surface of a financial system that seemed to be growing smoothly. This vulnerability was not new, and it had to do with the very delicate balance on the financial seesaw of risk. The safe side of the seesaw held reliable assets, like Treasury bills. The other side of the seesaw held risky assets, like stocks and corporate debt. The Fed was pumping $80 billion a month onto the safe side of the seesaw by purchasing Treasury bills, which in turn depressed the interest rates, or yield, on those bills. As had been happening for a decade, this forced investors to push their money to the risky side, seeking yield. Something worrisome started to happen in March. Treasury interest rates had started to climb, regardless of the Fed's intervention. There were lots of reasons for the yields to rise. Investors expected the economy to grow, which pushed up rates, for example. But the journal article highlighted another, potentially more dangerous reason: the sheer amount of debt the U.S. government was issuing. President Trump and the Republicans in Congress had passed a tax cut in 2017 that forced the government to borrow $1 trillion every year to keep the government running, even when the economy was at its peak in 2019. When the pandemic hit, Congress approved more than $2 trillion in spending in the CARES Act alone, all of it financed by deficit spending. In March, President Biden signed a new $1.90 trillion rescue package. This was heralded as the first major rescue bill in decades that steered the majority of its spending to poor and working-class people. All of this meant that the U.S. Treasury would be selling about $2.80 trillion in Treasury bills during 2021. The Journal article documented the troubling fact that there might not be enough demand for all that debt to keep Treasury interest rates down at the low levels where the Fed had been pushing them. Demand was worryingly soft during a couple of Treasury bill auctions that month. Analysts believed there might be a buyer's strike for some Treasury bills, which would require the government to pay higher interest rates to entice buyers. If Treasury rates rose, all that investment cash on Wall Street would be enticed to move toward the safe end of the seesaw, finding shelter in the higher, safer yields that had been denied for so long. This would drain cash out of the markets for leveraged loans, stocks, CLO, and all the risky structures that Wall Street had been busily building for many years. Powell and his team would then face a familiar choice. They could let the risky structures fall or intervene once again with more quantitative easing and emergency programs. Powell faced a similar choice when money rushed out of risky assets in late 2018, and he chose the path of creating more money to soothe markets. This encouraged more speculation and asset inflation. Honig believed that the Fed would almost certainly once again choose the path of money creation if debt prices rose and markets teetered. "You see the complications we're building for ourselves going forward," Honig said. Honig kept churning out his essays and his white papers. He was 74 years old, and at the end of his career his ideas didn't seem much more popular than they were before. His papers were not read widely. He was rarely invited to speak on cable news shows. But Honig's arguments were as relevant in 2021 as they were a decade earlier. This didn't reflect the consistency of his views so much as the intractability of America's long-term problems. In many important ways, the financial crash of 2008 had never ended. It was a long crash that crippled the economy for years. The problems that caused it went almost entirely unsolved. And this financial crash was compounded by a long crash in the strength of America's democratic institutions. When America relied on the Federal Reserve to address its economic problems, it relied on a deeply flawed tool. All the Fed's money only widened the distance between America's winners and losers and laid the foundation for more instability. This fragile financial system was wrecked by the pandemic, and in response the Fed created yet more new money, amplifying the earlier distortions. The long crash of 2008 had evolved into the long crash of 2020. The bills had yet to be paid. The Fed was spending $120 billion a month in quantitative easing, with $80 billion going toward Treasury bonds and $40 billion going toward mortgage-backed securities. Oceanofpdf.com. Acknowledgements. I am indebted to one person in particular for spurring me to write this book. I met him in 2016. He was a source for an earlier reporting project, and he talked with me on condition of anonymity, so I can't name him here. This source was brilliant and fascinating. Everyone who worked with him confirmed that he was probably a genius. Our first interview lasted 11 hours. During the first 4 or 5 hours, we talked about the subject of my earlier project. But as the day wore on, this source wanted to talk about other things, which he considered to be far more important. He wanted to talk about asset prices. This gentleman, who sometimes goes by the initials ZC, was extremely generous with his time and his insights over the ensuing years. I am grateful, sir, for your help. Thomas Honig was remarkably generous with his time over several years as I pursued his story. Honig deals with reporters in a way that I believe is rare these days. He doesn't seek attention, but he answered all the questions I put to him, even when they were adversarial and argumentative. My sense is that Honig felt an obligation to answer questions from a reporter because that is part of being a public servant. I am grateful for his candor. I am also profoundly grateful to each and every current and former official and employee of the Federal Reserve who agreed to speak to me for this book, both on and off the record. It is simply impossible for a reporter to learn anything without such sources, and my sincere hope is that I was able to synthesize all these interviews into the best available version of the truth. This book would not have been possible without my agent, Lauren Sharp, who has the very difficult job of trying to sell book ideas. Lauren couldn't have been thrilled when I said I was becoming obsessed with quantitative easing and wanted to write a book about it. But she heard me out, and from the earliest days she encouraged me to keep digging. When it came time to put the idea into concrete form, Lauren worked overtime to help me shape and edit the book proposal. She has been a steadfast supporter every step of the way, and I am so grateful for it. As always, I am deeply indebted to my editor at Simon & Schuster, Priscilla Paynton, who has shaped and guided every book I've written. Priscilla is a steady leader with absolutely impeccable ethics and judgment. She represents the best school of American journalism, and I am grateful every day to learn from her. I am also deeply indebted to Jonathan Karp, President and CEO of Simon & Schuster. Lucas Whitman, a senior editor at Time magazine, edited my first and only magazine story about the Federal Reserve. Lucas was exceptionally supportive, thoughtful, and smart as he guided the story through a tumultuous evolution. It began as a profile of the 2019 repo market intervention, back in the halcyon days of January 2020. When I went to New York to visit the Fed Bank there, people were just starting to wear face masks and the stock market was beginning to crash. Lucas hung with the story and helped expand it into a profile of Jay Powell and the Fed's unprecedented interventions during the COVID-19 crisis. I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to work with a real pro like Lucas and the entire team at Time. Thank you for the chance to do it. While I wrote and reported this book, my institutional home was the Watchdog Writers Group, a nonprofit journalism institute based at the University of Missouri School of Journalism. I am thankful, every day, for the generous support the WWG receives from 11th Hour Project of the Schmidt Family Foundation. I am particularly grateful to Wendy Schmidt, Sarah Bell, Joe Ciortino, Amy Rao and Ellen Peabody and the entire team at 11th Hour for their tireless work and support. I am also grateful for the support provided to the WWG by the William T. Kemper Foundation in Kansas City, and the help from Jonathan Kemper, Charlotte Kemper, and Sarah Fox. The WWG operates with complete editorial independence and the group's funders were not involved in any way in shaping, guiding, or providing any kind of input for this book or any of my journalism. I am so thankful that the WWG is operating under the guidance of Randy Picht at the Reynolds Journalism Institute, who has been a wonderful mentor and leader for the program. Dean David Kerpius, Mark Horvath, Randall Smith, Katie Swan, Allison Young, Ron Stoghill, and so many others at the School of Journalism have been invaluable in making the program work. Kelly Dariak joined the WWG during the summer of 2020 to help me research Tom Honig's tenure at the FDIC for Chapter 11 of this book. Kelly's weekly memos and reports were simply indispensable to understanding the FDIC itself, along with Honig's efforts at the institution. Kelly also helped illuminate the banking crisis of the 1980s, and I couldn't have kept up without her. Earlier in 2020, Alexander Holt did me the favor of lending his remarkable mind to this effort. Alex helped me in the very earliest stages of my reporting on the Fed, as I began to dig into the repo market bailout of 2019. Alex nimbly surveyed the entire landscape of information about the repo market and the Fed, from scholarly articles to financial analyst reports and news articles. I never would have understood the terrain without him. He spent many an hour at the Panera in Silver Spring helping me understand the mechanics of repos, reverse repos, and, maybe most important, the dreaded kink in the demand curve for bank reserves. It would be impossible to fully tally all the hours we talked about this, and all I can say is that I am so grateful to have had the chance to work with him. I am also so grateful to work with researcher Susan Binkuya, who fact-checked this book. Sue can find mistakes and inaccuracies with laser-guided accuracy, and she improved the book throughout. Needless to say, any remaining mistakes are mine and mine alone. This book would not have been possible without access to the outstanding coverage of the Federal Reserve in our nation's leading newspapers, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. Among the reporters whose work I am most indebted to are John Hilsenrath, Nick Timmerhouse, and Greg Ip at the Journal, Heather Long at the Post, and Matt Phillips, Neil Irwin, Gina Smielek, and Peter S. Goodman at the Times. These reporters are all doing a hero's job, every day, to document what is happening in our nation's financial institutions and markets, and I was so grateful to have been able to rely on their work as I tried to understand what the Fed has done over the last decade. Any office where I work slowly becomes buried in piles of newspapers with notes scribbled all over them, and I am deeply thankful for the luxury of having these papers delivered to my doorstep. As always, I am profoundly grateful for the entire team at Simon & Schuster. Hannah Park was an absolute maestro from beginning to end, helping the entire project proceed under adverse conditions. Samantha Hoback and her team did an exceptional job of editing and improving the manuscript. Robert Messenger was extraordinarily generous with his time, insight, and editing ability, and his attention made the book much better. Larry Hughes, as always, was simply indispensable in helping get the word out about the book, a very hard job in a media environment that grows more cacophonous by the day. Muriel Hessler and Michael Whitney literally gave me shelter from the storm by providing me a place to work as I finished this book in the throes of a pandemic. Thank you so much for your generosity, and thank you to Kimberly and Eric Springer for making it happen. Jane and Paul Malloy were so kind to give my family a chance to get away during the heat of it all, and we are grateful for the memories. My only bridge to sanity during lockdown was the bus stop crew, who evolved into the Fireball crew when everything came to a sudden stop. Thank you so much to Kevin and Kate Gunthert, Damian and Rachel Rindelman, Andy and Emily Pruger, and Andy Souza and Caroline Broder for keeping the neighborhood together. Jerry Hovis, Christy Walmo, Rob and Deb Levy, Lars and Lucy Voles, and Dave and Carly Flanagan made Silver Spring home. Thank you for all the support over the years. Jerry and Christy, we will all remember to walk like Will. David Gibbons and Stacy Ritchie were fantastic friends and also fantastic sounding boards for my political ideas during my years in Silver Spring. David was kind enough to review my work on the Fed and give me very thoughtful feedback, which helped me see things more clearly. Thank you so much for your time and your very sharp insights. Steve Levine and Nuri Nerlibayeva have been great friends and great supporters all along the way. Thank you. As always, I am permanently indebted to Andres Martinez and Steve Call for giving me the chance of a lifetime back in 2012, which paved the way for every book I've written. I hope this book reflects some of the values that were imparted to me by my elders while growing up in Kansas City. We lost too many of them during 2020. My beloved Uncle David Launder was a great role model to me, and I thank him for it. I also thank John and Linda Robertson for the example they provided the rest of us about how to live a full and good life. Thank you. As always, Mom, David, and Blythe were the ones I turned to when I really needed guidance. Thank you for always being there. The first person who reads my books is the most important person in my life, my wife, Josie Leonard. This time around, she was joined by a new editor, my daughter Sophia Leonard. Both of them made this book much better, much sharper, and much cleaner. It was delightful to hear my daughter walk around the house exclaiming things about Paul Volcker. George and Margot were extraordinarily tolerant of my long absences and my absent-mindedness during the intense period of writing this book. Most important, all of you remind me why I write books in the first place, and you help keep me on the right path. Thank you. oceanofpdf.com. More from the author.